Risk-adjusted strategy, business continuity, crisis management, disaster management, and resilience. These are all big buzzwords in today's COVID climate. While this first global pandemic in over 100 years presents mega challenges for businesses and society at large, it also presents, I suggest, opportunities for risk managers. Companies in the past have been reluctant possibly to invest in risk management activities, risk response strategies, and business continuity testing and crisis management. Is all of that changing, I wonder? Bridy Paxton is Marsh Advisory's Africa leader and joins me on the spotlight in association with the Institute of Risk Management. The pandemic, the crisis, and the professional approach. How has your job, I wonder, changed in the past 5 months?
Wow, a lot. I think firstly, looking at risk, how important it actually is. And not only from a work perspective, but from a personal perspective. Every day, each and every single one of us has had to deal with risk. Do I go to the shops? Do I not go to the shops? And in the business environment, even more so. I think what has become clearly important is the ability for us to be agile. We have to be very, very quick in how we respond to risks. As an example, just from the business perspective, we had to take a step back and quickly think, well, in this crisis, what do we do to try and help our clients? And one of the first things that we did, not only from our region here, but as a global firm, connected to be able to provide a very practical guide for our clients to understand, well, what do we need to think of to get back to the office, safely for all our people. I also think from a people perspective, what has been really difficult is, looking at and understanding the mental impact that this has had. So maybe personally again, but in terms of my team, not being able to actually, see them in person. And we take for granted a lot of things. So in the office environment, you'd be going down for lunch, you'd bump into someone that you probably wouldn't have planned to that day, and you'd end up having a conversation and sometimes even making a business decision.
Or solving a problem.
A problem. And now, if you don't purposefully create that time with that person, it doesn't happen.
I want to come back to that word agile or agility. Help me understand what you mean by that and how organizations within risk management can become more agile.
So I think if we take it back to the current state of what we're in, we were in a place that we had to quickly respond to this, but at the same time, we then had to understand how do we recover. Then we also had to think about how do we rebound as an organization, but also what does the organization look like into the future? So how do we reimagine that business? Taking into account skill sets may be very different, taking into account technology, which has just sort of, overtaken us during this time. So for me, it's really, it's beyond a risk strategy. Anyone can have a risk strategy. Anyone can have policies and procedures. But how have you implemented that in the organization?
As quickly as possible.
As quickly as possible.
So how do you teach an organization to do that?
So practically, it's about how have we planned and prepared. So as an example, we're going to continue seeing these future shocks happening. No one could have necessarily predicted this. As an organization, we need to sort of create these scenarios of what could potentially happen and plan around that. Practice, how would we actually respond? So by the time a future shock happens, it's not necessarily that that's going to be that exact same scenario, but it's how we were quickly able to respond to that with the practice that we had in a difficult environment.
But no one can foresee those unexpected or so-called black swan events.
Correct.
How does a company's philosophy have to readjust in order to expect the unexpected?
A couple of things. I think organizations in the past when looking at risk, focused very much internally. So what does this mean for me and my business? Sometimes not taking into account what are those external factors. And even as an industry, we focus on the risks within our industry, but have we actually thought beyond that to understand another industry, if a risk materializes on that side, could actually have an impact on us?
The domino effect, in other words.
Correct. The interconnectedness of all these risks and what is that impact? So, once again, creating almost that impossible scenario that we would never think might happen. And if it did, what would we do? And it goes back to planning and practicing.
How do you conceptualize an impossible scenario?
So, not easy, right? A good example, though, if you look, we work every year with the World Economic Forum and present an annual report where they actually put certain scenarios forward that could happen. And interestingly enough, if we look at the situation in now, I think it was probably 2 years back, it was a scenario that they put out there to say, if this happens, how would we actually respond? So I think it's
You're talking about the pandemic?
Correct.
And what happened? Did everyone just say, well, it'll never happen? And look where that got us.
Well, exactly. Where are we right now?
Yeah.
And I think it's about taking the time to actually focus on that, have those awkward discussions and making sure that you're taking the time out to do that. And
Whose
not
job is
focusing
that in
on
an
the now.
organization to think about the awkward possibilities?
Everyone. It goes back to, how have we actually embedded, not a policy, not a procedure, but have we actually embedded the risk culture in the organization? Structurally, it's important to embed that from a governance perspective. So ultimately, the accountability sits with the board on top, but then that needs to infiltrate down through the organization, throughout your different levels of assurance.
I don't understand what you mean by a risk culture in an organization.
Like I said, it's firstly, do we have a risk strategy? And that's, the easy part.
That's the hygiene side of it.
That's
If you'd
exactly.
be stupid not to. Yeah.
And we set that, at a board level. And that's fine. But then what? Have we actually implemented, number one? And when it starts moving to a risk culture, it becomes how we behave. So is everyone throughout the organization actually thinking about risk? And it's something that becomes, every part of our daily lives. It's not, I know I need to do this procedure. It becomes part of your DNA.
I would argue that you can overthink it, though, is that you can become so obsessed, you can be held hostage by concern about risk that you actually don't take any.
Oh, absolutely.
Great organizations are predicated on taking risk. Find the balance for me.
So that fine line, when we talk about risk, immediately everyone looks at it as a downside. But it's understanding what the impact is potentially from a downside, but then also looking at the opportunity, right? So as an example, again, if we just look at the current environment, there was, the tourism industry took a huge knock. But on the other side,
decimated, yeah.
On the other side, we saw many other sectors sort of come up with things that we didn't necessarily have before on the increase, on the rise, like online shopping, deliveries. Those things is where we actually saw opportunity come from this. Another example, just within our organization, and as you know, we're a global firm, and what this did was we somehow were able to collaborate at a very different level than we were before, from all our colleagues globally, and coming together as a collective to create these solutions and help our clients in these desperate times.
Let's assume you've got the risk strategy, and I want to confine this next question and answer to COVID-19. You've got the strategy. How do you adapt or change the strategy midway through a crisis? Because that would be your area of expertise.
And I think that's critical if we go back to the basics, if I can say, of risk management. If we're not able to do that as an organization, that means we're getting it wrong. Risk management is not static. It needs to be something that is living and, is something that we're actually adapting all the time. So it's not necessary to say that this should only happen in a crisis. We should be doing this, as we go through, like I said, every single day. I think, this situation probably a bit harder, but going back, if we've planned properly and we've practiced certain scenarios, that we're quickly able to, come back to that agility that we need. I think what has also been important and what we've seen is that if you have a plan, once again, it can't be static. There's a lot of things during this time that all of us are learning as we go. And we put a plan together, we put controls in place to try and mitigate the risks, and then something happens the next day and we've got to take a step back and say, okay, this didn't work. What was the root cause?
So
how do we readjust?
It's that argument of rigidity versus agility, which is critical.
Yeah.
Let's assume that at some point we'll come out of this. The indications that are already level 2 right now, possibly level 1. Caution is still needed, will be with us for a long time, but the global economy is starting to open up again. How do you reinvent or change a risk strategy post-COVID? I mean, your clients must be asking you that now at this point.
So my answer would be, if you haven't yet, that's a problem. That should have already been in discussions. We're seeing the seismic shifts. What does that mean for the organization? How do we actually manage operations afterwards? So, like I said, all these new things that are going to come around technology. If we look at our people, are we dealing with the heightened mental issues that we'll see, but then on the other side, the skill sets that are going to completely change. Do we need people in organizations that are way more resilient than we would have seen before?
You segue into an important point then. You're committed as an organization to building risk capacity in this country, improving the risk industry. How are you doing that? Are you succeeding?
So I think it's not something that any single organization or person can do alone. I think it is a combination of various stakeholders that need to come together, that need to collaborate, not only from a regional level, but from a global level. I think it needs to take into account not only the public sector, but the private sector as well, to really be in a position where we're focusing on these challenges that we have from an economic perspective, from an environmental perspective, technology, public health and safety, and really come together, understand, create that awareness amongst everyone, and then act quickly and purposefully to really get to where we should be.
And in that respect, you've got to have a plan. And what you're also doing is that you're partnering with IRMSA in updating this thing called the Risk Management Guideline. Explain that to me and what you're doing.
Correct. And I think it comes at such a right time for us. So as Marsh, we are extremely excited about this journey that we're starting together. And it really goes back to what I mentioned earlier is, we cannot do it alone. We need to work together. It creates a good platform to us to get the message out there. And I think all of these things that we've discussed, right, is including that in that guideline to really help individuals, organizations out there about thinking about risk differently and taking the lessons that we've learned now. I think one of the key things...
How are you doing that?
So we're partnering together. I think looking at, the guidelines that we've had previously and saying, well, if we look at the seismic shifts that are happening, what are those key principles that we've probably been missing? How do we guide those better? So one of the key things for me is around the discussion on strategy versus risk. two things that a lot of the time we look at separately, and it can't
So
be.
you've got to look at integration.
It's got to be integrated. Any organization, your risk profile, your risk strategy, appetite, tolerance has to be defined by your strategy.
With what objective then? What would you like to see change in that respect?
So I think the way we think about risk, so maybe taking it back to strategy, we need to understand what is our strategy as an organization. And from that, what are our strategic objectives? In order to deliver that, what does that mean for us? And unpacking that allows us to start thinking of, well, in order to do this, what are those risks that could potentially hinder us from achieving those objectives? And also not keeping that in isolation in terms of the organization, but also all those external factors that could impact us, as well as the interconnectedness of all these risks, and globally as well. So in the past, risks were very much focused regionally in what's happening in my current environment. But as we've seen, risks have no more borders. And something that is happening far away can quickly impact us here.
It sounds to me as if your sector has got an enormous amount of work to do in this respect, but at least progress is being made. Bridy Paxton, thank you very much indeed. Marsh Advisory's Africa leader, thank you very much for joining us. I just want to remind you very quickly of the annual UMSA conference. It is in digital form this year with the theme Seeing a Risk Intelligence Future. The dates, you ask? Well, the 30th of September and the 1st of October. Details are on your screen right now. And thank you for watching Spotlight.